It is an honor and a pleasure to serve as host for Arlyn Osborne's presentation, From Evaluation to Curiosity, the Tip of the Iceberg with Traumatized Children. Arlyn and I worked together at Center for a Nonviolent Community for nearly a decade, and we share the love of children and playfulness. Arlyn is a trauma therapist at Center for a Nonviolent Community, Matheson Health Clinic, and in private practice in Tuolumne County, working with children, teens, and adults. The form Q&A we'll take during this session is that Arlyn will pause and ask me what I think participants might be wondering, what questions you might have. So with that, Arlyn, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Robin. So I want to thank Robin, who enticed me to do this. This is not my normal environment to be speaking like this. And I want to just note that Robin is the person that got me into becoming a therapist. I used to watch the children come to see her at the Center for a Nonviolent Community, and there would be a child hiding somewhere in the waiting room, scared, maybe under a table, under a chair, behind something. And that would be their first appointment. And in the second appointment, I would see this child running down the hallway, Robin, Robin. And to me, it was miraculous to watch a difference like that in children. So Robin taught me child-centered play therapy and many other things. And I am very grateful to you, Robin.
As I am to you, Arlyn.
So I also want to thank Karina Lindblom and the other people who've done the organization here to make this work. And thanks to Eli, that you cannot see, but he is in the corner of our room, keeping things running smoothly. And without him, we would crash, believe me. So my last thank you is to Beacon House. This is a site in the UK, and Beacon House allowed me, I got their permission to go ahead and give out some of their handouts, and also to include some of their handouts in my slides today. They have wonderful information and resources for parents, teachers, and therapists on their website. And I encourage you to go to their website and use some of their information. Now, I'm putting together what I've learned over probably the last 7 years or more. About trauma. And so there's a lot of information. I'm going to go through the first kind of dense bit of it first. And then I want us to look at what kind of tools I've come up with, what are some kind of resources you can use, and what are some kinds of interventions. So as we get started, I want us to take a poll. So go ahead and start the, okay. So what I'd like you to do is take the poll and do your best to choose one of those categories. It would help us to know, as I provide examples or ideas, to know how you fit into these categories. Okay. Robin, can you just jot this down? Okay. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and end the polling. We've got a lot of others. I wonder, maybe probation, maybe general public. All right, thank you so much for doing this. So while she's getting these results, let me just explain who I am as a therapist. My title at CNBC is trauma therapist. I am an EMDR therapist. I do internal family systems work. I do DBT, I do child-centered play therapy, filial therapy, where the parent learns to do their own therapy with the child, somewhat similar to TheraPlay. And so a lot of what I'm going to present today comes from that focus of how I do my practice. How you doing? Okay. Okay. Thank you. So we're going to move to the slides now. Okay. As we start, I want to acknowledge the first peoples of this land and extend you my deep respect. Okay. So I have a picture of an iceberg because we don't know what's underneath when we first start to see a child. We may take a history, but we may not know, and we may never know everything that's happened to that child. I think it's important for us to keep our minds open and keep our curiosity open. As clinicians, we're trained to quickly diagnose and set up a treatment plan. And yet with children with trauma, we need to step back a little more and do some observation and revise as we need to. And because most trauma with children is relational, it's caused by another person close to that child. It's very important how we approach a child, how we interact with a child, and how we feel about it. So when I'm talking about evaluations here, I'm talking about how we judge, make sense of, interact with a child. Okay, here's the outline. I want us to expand our evaluations to include trauma. I want us to look at the range of systems an infant or child negotiates while they're experiencing trauma. Development happens at a breakneck speed with children from infancy on. I want to look briefly at the child's resources for adaptation to trauma. Here's an infant next to a parent who may or may not be paying attention to it. What resources does that infant have in order to adapt to some harm that's happening? Symptoms we see that are the results of the body, brain, and relational adaptations to trauma. And I want to explore how we can do some effective interventions, and Robin has convinced me to bring some things. So as we start, we're going to try one right now. All right, so this is one for regulating a child who's very dysregulated and grounding. So I want you, as I open this sphere up, I want you to breathe in, and as I close it, I want you to breathe out, okay? Okay. So now I feel like I've arrived a little. Thank you, Robin, for suggesting that. All right. So, all right. Children have an innate drive. If we aren't curious about their behavior, and these slides are in your handouts, large size. There's the slide handouts and there's the additional handouts. So I encourage you to pull those out so you can read them better than you might be able to on the screen. Remember that children already feel bad about their behaviors, so making them feel worse is not going to change anything. What it may do is drive them into acting in even more dysregulated ways. So show that you care, get yourself a break, move away for a little while, give yourself some space until you're regulated, and then with kind of a matter-of-fact, kind voice, be curious about what happened once the child is also regulated. And then that way, then you can help the child learn how to sense what goes on in their bodies and make their own ways of changing their behaviors. We can't be with them all the time, so they have to learn to do their own problem solving. All right, so this is the top half of one of the slides that you have in your packet. And when a child is in hyperarousal, they're very likely to get diagnosed, especially if it's chronic from trauma, they may be diagnosed with mania, separation anxiety, ADHD, autism spectrum disorder, conduct disorder, anxiety disorder, oppositional defiant. Notice how many of these diagnoses are relational. They're in the eyes of someone who is reacting or interacting with the child. It doesn't mean they don't have an additional diagnosis that's going along with it. However, until we address the trauma, we're not going to know how much their behaviors and their interactions are affected by the actual, maybe the ADHD in addition. It could be exacerbated by the stress or exacerbated by the trauma as well. So a child that's hypoaroused may be diagnosed with panic, phobia. They may be catatonic in some ways. They may be lazy. They may be a daydreamer. obsessive compulsive disorder, depression. These are all really important for us to recognize in children. But again, it's important to see how much trauma overlays this and exacerbates what might be a comorbidity here. All right, types of trauma identified in the literature. There's the big T's. A lot of us are pretty familiar with this. There's a car accident. There could be medical procedures that were pretty invasive and scary for a child. There could be falling out of a tree. There could be a loss of a parent. There could be foster care. So the immediate loss or a one-time situation is a big T. And I know in the earlier session, in the earlier talk, there was mention of the ACEs, the adverse childhood experiences. The little T's are what those are about. And this is the most enduring and damaging of trauma. It can be developmental. It can interact with neurological problems or genetic problems that are already there. There can be complex trauma. So a child that may have attachment wounding, insecure attachment, along with maybe physical and emotional abuse, maybe living with a parent who has mental illness and cannot always be attentive due to their situation, and possibly sexual assault on top. It becomes what we call complex trauma. Attachment trauma, if a baby doesn't get what it needs, the mirroring, the attunement from its caregiver, then it has to make adaptations. And the way it attaches to everyone from then on in its life may be a bit disruptive and not seem really useful to some of us. Chronic trauma, just ongoing stress in their life, which also leads into the intergenerational. Intergenerational, one of the beliefs is that the trauma that a family surrounds a child with, because it's relationally past, can go for 14 generations in the past. So a child may be receiving the adaptations that the adults in the family made to the trauma for 14 generations. There's also environmental, social, and cultural. A lot of that is being looked at right now. What does it mean to have, you might have the best family in the world, but you might have discrimination everywhere you go, or bias against you, or social inequities. So these are the little T's. Trauma in childhood often affects and interacts with the normal developmental process. Now, if you imagine this going in breakneck speed, you're going to be looking at the brain first. So the brainstem develops first. Some people call this the lizard brain, the primitive brain. It's more instinctual, more of a reflex or a reaction. And then the limbic brain, which has to do with attachment and emotional development, then up in the cortical brain, where the children are able to do thinking, learning, language, and inhibiting. A lot of people use Siegel's image to work with children using their hand. So if you have the hand, you have the brainstem here. This is the limbic system. You imagine it being tucked right in, kind of in the middle bottom of the brain, and then the cortex curves over it. And when a child gets dysregulated, once children learn this symbology, they can begin to say to you, I flipped my lid, and their emotions go haywire at that point. So this is a helpful thing. I'm going to bring it up again and again today. So again, the brainstem is first, then it moves, once that's developed, it moves into the limbic system, and then up into the cortex. This is a brief way of looking at this. All right, so just to get a little more detail, I want you to notice on the right-hand side, it goes from brainstem up to midstem, midbrain, limbic, cortex, and the neocortex. Sorry, I know you probably can't quite see that on the screen because of my picture in the middle there, but yeah, okay. So if a child already has neurological deficits that affect some of this, and then there's trauma on top, you might find, and I have found this with children referred to me, a child that has a hard time eating, swallowing, even though they seem to be functioning well in other ways. A child maybe who has had some interactions with their sensory system where they are not able to hold their bowel movements, and they may be in elementary school and they still have encopresis. And yet there are other things that they do. So it's not always a straight line up, but if you look at what is necessary in each part of the brain for the other parts to develop, I think it's really important to have this awareness as we're looking for what's going on with the child, what might be something that works with this child when they get dysregulated or they're having a hard time. So for instance, look at the very top in the cortex, the neocortex, we're talking about the ability to modulate reactivity and impulsivity, a lot of the executive functioning. Well, if a child is in fight or flight, you can talk to them till you're blue in the face and they're not going to be able to hear you about calming down. That part of the brain is not online. They have flipped their lid, okay? They're down here. They're not even up in the sensory system where they are able to take in information from the outside. Okay. What's available to the child in the brainstem and the midbrain? So what a child can do in those parts of the brain is they can react and be reflexive. This is when we talk about fight or flight. It's now, Porges and others have developed this into a bit more detail and into subsystems. It's a little more complex. So Porges talks about the polyvagal system, this dorsal vagal and ventral vagal nerves that wind through the body. And the sympathetic nervous system will go into fight or flight when there is danger perceived. But these systems also have to do with engaging socially, with being relational. They have to do with immobilization or shutdown, a freeze response, but also the full shutdown. So when you see a very depressed child, a limp child, a child that's not very responsive, but is still functioning in the world, might be in school, but just does not seem to care, they may be in a parasympathetic dorsal reaction, and then also dissociative states when they get more severe. So this is more of the same, sorry, being redundant here. So here's a piece that I think is really important. We're now looking at more than a few sensory systems, and one sense that is very important comes through the autonomic nervous system, and it's neuroception. It's constantly sensing the environment, it's checking in with the internal organs, and it's also checking in with nearby nervous systems. So you're probably familiar with this. You notice how you're standing next to someone and you just have a sense they're really angry or something. That's what this is. Children, especially children with trauma, have antennae that spot what we're thinking, how we're feeling. They are constantly sensing our body language, the tension in our bodies, and they are reacting to it. Due to trauma, children may react to things that aren't happening. So in actual safe situations, the defense system may activate in response to a cue. So for instance, a child who may have been sexually assaulted or harmed while someone was smiling may see a smile and just get triggered, and suddenly they're in a defense system. And anyone just looking at that would go, what on earth happened? Why is this child losing it right now? In actual dangerous situations, it may inhibit the defense system. So a child may not even feel pain or may not react. In social engagement systems, it may not be available or may not be fully developed. What's available to the child in the upper midbrain and the limbic areas of the brain? These processes are reactive and emotional. And underlying them are these 7 subcortical affective mammalian action systems. Now, Panksepp and Bivin have been working on this for quite a while. I love their descriptions, so I urge you to go to the resources. But this is play, seeking care, fear, rage, and lust. If you have mammalian pets at home, like cats and dogs, you see this. You see mammals doing these different things. Rage and fear can be protective action systems. Care. For instance, a child whose parents are not able to care for them may turn on their care system and begin to care for the parents. They may begin to care for their siblings, finding food, finding whatever they need. The seeking system, that helps a baby and then later children to seek attunement, attachment, to seek a caregiver, to seek what they need in the world. And here's one of my favorites. Let's see. Oh, wait, I want to read this first. So these are not environmentally created. So this is a little different from lived experiences that may be up in the cortical part of the brain. These are what Panksepp and Bivin call ancestral passions. When these systems are stimulated in humans, the emotional feelings are intense. It's kind of like being in the brainstem and going into fight or flight. There's a reaction. It's the body reacting, not the thinking mind. In these passions, they get triggered in various ways, and they get to do the things that they were designed to do. So, for instance, in play, Robin and I often say this, and Dr. Perry is very clear about this, as well as Gomez and Van Fleet. They say the brain seeks healing, and play is the language of children and is the vehicle for healing. And I find this works even with teenagers. I think it's really important to find ways to play. And this is what play looks like in a pure form, a mammalian form. Bouncy light movements. You've seen your cats, your dogs do this. Back and forth interactions with others. It can look like aggression, but when you look closely, it's just being playful, taking turns being dominant and submissive, and it's fun, it's enjoyable, though, and especially with children, over time, children may get into bullying when they're playing with the aggression and dominant submissive. Okay, tools and cognitive processes available to children in the cortex are concrete and abstract. And children can't use these unless they're in what we call the window of tolerance. They have to have the awareness of emotions and think at the same time. So if they're in the brainstem and they're going into fight or flight or somewhere close to it, or they're dysregulated emotionally in the middle brain, they may not have that awareness of emotions and thinking at the same time. So no matter how many words you use with them, they may not be able to respond to you. And in fact, too many words may send them even further down the brainstem to more of just a basic terror. So it's always important to be seeing what you can of the child, what kind of symptoms they're displaying. Other tools available to children in the brain, developmental and protective factors that can become maladaptive with trauma. So attachment in the prefrontal brain. So I want to talk about this a little bit because this gets developed when there is mirroring, when there is attachment going on, and caregiving, like a parent is holding their baby and looking at them back and forth and mirroring the expressions, the sounds, when a parent attunes to a child. This part of the brain is really important. It's a mediator and connector between the lower and upper brain. And it also facilitates and connects between the emotional right brain that develops earlier and the logical left brain later. So this repeated parental soothing, attunement, and care builds the cells in the prefrontal part of the brain, giving it a better ability to facilitate cooperation of parts of the brain. So just for a minute, imagine a child that didn't get this developed well. They're going to have starts and stops. They're going to have trouble with parts of this communication within the brain. Okay, for secure attachment, the caregiver needs to be present, needs to show interest in the child, needs to be reliable and consistent. As therapists, we often say, if you're going to work with children with trauma, you need to be trustworthy and dependable. That's the base right there, just trustworthy and dependable. And to securely attach, they need the soothing, the safety, the protection, to be seen and known, which is attunement, delighted in and valued and supported during their exploration and development. Now, no parent is perfect, but the best they can do with this is everything you can do is better and better. Everything helps. And for those of you who work with children, even if it's 5 or 10 minutes, attuning to a child, delighting in a child, listening to a child can provide one more leg up for that part of the brain that is still seeking that development. All right, adaptive information processing and defenses. So I'm going to skip a few slides here, but I want to mention that because I'm an EMDR therapist, we look at the adaptive information processing. And I'm going to explain that just briefly, which is that we believe that in the brain, when something traumatic happens, if the child is not able to handle the intensity of emotion and doesn't have a regulated adult to help them know that they will live through it, they fear survival, and it gets kind of locked up in the brain, kind of encapsulated in the brain. And then when they get triggered, it can shoot off like boo, 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 boo. And suddenly you're like, wow, this child just dropped an ice cream cone, but they're acting like the world ended and they're not going to be able to survive. That's something goes off in the brain. So the brain protects the child. That's one of the resources they have. But often as adults, that's a lot of our work as therapists, is to help someone begin to actually process some of that emotions that have felt absolutely unbearable. They also, the way a child forms their personality and the way a child uses dissociation is very important to know. All right, so I'm just gonna skip through a few of these. And I encourage you to maybe look at some of my resources and explore a little. A parent or caregiver attunes to and meets the child's needs. So even when a child's dysregulated, being really attuned, they're dysregulated, but I'm calm and I can be with you. When the caregiver or parent cannot, the child begins to adapt. What a child can do when they're scared or being harmed is to do something to themselves. They obviously cannot affect the caregivers. So what they do is they may make decisions, they may hide, they may find ways to go into their brain and dissociate. And it's really important to them. One of the most important things for survival is to stay connected with their caregiver. So they begin to make agreements with the caregiver, like I must never be angry, I must never need anything, I must never be weak, or I must not know what was done to me. I must take care of my parent. There are any number of these that a child can make. And many of us, if we think back, what are the agreements we made to live within our family of origin? Many of us have agreements that we made. And it doesn't mean we're all traumatized, but there are many different levels of trauma. All right, so a child that has a neglectful caregiver may have to, or one that's changeable, maybe using drugs and sometimes is very attentive and other times maybe is not able to be attentive and maybe other times is actually abusive. A child in their brain has to develop a part of their personality to interact with each of those different ways that a caregiver presents to them. And so sometimes when we're dealing with children later in life, we're wondering why they're suddenly acting very aggressive or something. Well, they may have had to inside themselves create a part of their personality like someone who was very scary to them in order to feel like they can protect themselves. So they may have taken their abuser and created a part of their personality that's very similar. And then that gets triggered and active when they're feeling very scared or threatened. Okay, so what do we know underneath these children? We don't know a whole lot. So what we've got to do is kind of look at how we can help these children recognize little bits of what's going on with them. And it's kind of like step by step, the more trustworthy, attentive, attuned, consistent we can be with children, then the more the children will continue to repair their own development. So, Robin, as you're thinking about what people might be wondering about right now with all this big information before we head into different interventions.
Okay, Arlyn.
Is there anything?
I think people might be wondering about if some children go back and forth between hyper and hypoarousal. I mean, I know that there's a tendency for individuals to be one or the other, but are there situations or are there children that you have worked with and consulted about that go back and forth between hyper and hypo aroused?
Okay, I find that it really varies depending on the child. One child may have a habitual aroused reaction, another may have a habitual depressed or hypo reaction. But I have seen a few of them go back and forth, and often I think that is when they've had situations they've had to adapt to where they might be very aggressive, like on the playground or something, and then get very dysregulated in an aggressive way. But they also may, in the face of someone who's very scary, become kind of shrink into themselves and become a little, almost like invisible, if that makes sense.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. So the agreements that children make with their families of origin, those likely carry on into the school environment. What kind of advice would you give educators? I mean, they carry on into, but they probably take shape and form a little bit differently because of the different environment and the different relationships.
Right. So let's go back and you see this little girl here on the left who's looking very attentive and attuned and whatever, but if you look at her a little more closely, she may be also a little bit dissociated or putting on a personality part to handle what's going on in the schoolroom. So children may bring their agreements into the schoolroom. So if this child, for instance, was parentified at home and had to take care of the parents, this child may be trying to take care of the teacher. The teacher says, I'd like you to be attentive. The child may be being attentive to take care of the teacher, may bring the teacher things, may want to help out. It doesn't mean there's anything pathological about it, but just be aware. Be aware of what you're seeing in children and wonder a bit, be curious. Does that answer that question?
It does, and I wonder, so the list of agreements you made, I will not, throw one out at me.
I won't be weak.
I won't be weak. But then they're at school and it's a good idea to be strong. That must be such a difficult journey for a child. Do you think they stay in the I have? Well,
if they're not trying not to be weak,
not to be weak. That's what I mean. Right. Yeah. I'm sorry. I said it the wrong way.
Well, if you mean I need to not make myself seen, like a child who is seen in a household where there's physical abuse, they may try everything they can to not be seen. Right. If they go to school and they need to be seen, that can be a real struggle. Some of them have developed a part of their personality to handle that part of school, and others may just look. Maybe like the little boy here who's writing and he's just very quiet. He's not going to make a big scene. He's not going to make anything happen because he knows in some parts of his life what could happen if he becomes visible. It really depends. And this is why I'm really encouraging people to be really curious about children and how they're acting in the world. What are they seeing? Like the apparently incorrigible child. So a child that's raging, does it look like the body is reacting and they are in total terror and they can't hear you, which would be brainstem? Or does it look like they're in an emotional rage and still cannot always hear your words, but they are acting it out and they are also keeping themselves relatively safe? They're not throwing themselves into the chairs or into the tables. Right. Or are they looking right at you and the words they're saying are trying to get you to interact with them? That's a little more of the cortical area. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Thank you very much.
Okay.
That's all for now. Thank you.
Thanks. All right. So let's see. I think the most important part that I want to mention with this slide is in order to be observing and curious, we need to do enough self-care as adults. That the child's neuroception isn't going to pick up that we're having such a bad day that we really don't care how it goes in this interaction with them, or we're just so tired of how they're acting or whatever. it's really important that we take care of ourselves and learn strong self-regulation skills and stay curious instead of triggered. So I really have a lot of empathy for people working in the schools and for people that, like physicians that see children for a very short time, and therapists who work in the schools. You don't have enough time really to do what I get to do. I get to see them once a week for an hour, which is not much. But you might have 5 minutes, 10 minutes, or even a 2-minute interaction. And so taking care of yourself, looking at your own ability to handle stress, and also getting aware of what kind of agreements you made in your family of origin. What are the things that stress you? What is it in your personality or your experience if you've had trauma? What do you need to work on a little bit or get some help with? And I'm not trying to drum up business for therapists, but it can feel so good when you're not feeling yourself triggered inside. All right, so let's look at these children. Handouts are in your packet again. So instead of saying this is unacceptable behavior, let's see if we can say to ourselves, this is understandable behavior. It may take me a while to get what it is, but I'm going to do it. So I just want you to just look through these briefly. And this one, aggressive and frightened, that's really important for attachment, because a child that gets angry, that has attachment wounding, I want you to think scared instead of angry. They're appearing angry to us, but often they're scared. They're scared that the attachment's going to be broken. So you know those children that want to tell you everything that the other kids are doing? We call them tattletales. They may be seeking attachment with you. That seeking part of their mammalian system may be in action. A withdrawn child may be cautious. Rude may be self-protective, not engaging, maybe that the child doesn't feel safe yet. All right, so this is in your packet, and I really encourage you to pull it out and look at it, because this and one other Beacon House handout are going to be a lot of what we're talking about for a few minutes here. So as you look at this, these are sensory problems. These are the different symptoms you might see of sensory problems at home or at school. Right now, remember, sensory is kind of the top of it's the beginning of the midbrain, but still just above the brainstem. That's when it's developing. And it's not just children on the Asperger's spectrum that have sensory problems. I've seen children who are struggling with maybe language issues. Their family's primary language may not be what's used in school, and the stress level is triggering their sensory systems to react. There's various reasons why this will react. So I encourage you to really spend some time with this handout, just looking at what you're seeing. Attachment insecurity. So when we're talking about children with attachment insecurity, Mascara and Gomez have made it very clear that they believe, and they're not the only ones, but among them, they're EMDR treatment professionals in Spain. And they have found that children and teens and adults who have characteristics of borderline personality disorder, it's actually attachment wounding. And if they can then work with the parts of the child that are in distress, then they can begin to heal a lot of the symptoms that we see. Transitions, loss and change, big reactions. These are very difficult. A child without full attachment is going to be very afraid of being rejected, of people walking away from them, of losing friends. Emotional dysregulation at home. I think we're all pretty familiar with emotional dysregulation in children. That's one of the most obvious things. But some of it is a little different, like the rule breaking, the aggression, the running off and hiding. Cheerfulness and clingy behaviors at separation. And with teens, the self-harming, the drug use and promiscuity. So this is not just emotional dysregulation. Some of this could be attachment issues and things like that, but it's important to keep in mind what could be causing this, what is in the child's background that may need some attention that would help it to heal. Okay. So dissociation. Dissociation is a spectrum, and I skipped a slide about the kinds of dissociation. I think we're all familiar with being in math class and suddenly we realize we didn't hear what the teacher just said and we're like, oh no, I need that for homework. Or a child that might daydream and kind of get into fantasy a little bit or whatever. So that's kind of pretty normal dissociation. There's secondary dissociation, which is the beginning of the child has to develop different parts. So when I talked about the child dealing with the different ways a caregiver reacts and having to develop parts for each of that, that would be the beginnings of secondary dissociation, which becomes almost a structural dissociation. And some people call them ego states because often there's emotions, there's a body behaviors, and there are certain thoughts that a child has when they're in these different ways of relating with their personality. And it can go as far as very, very structural dissociated, which is dissociative identity disorder. But most people are somewhere on that spectrum from just normal dissociation into, any of us might have a few parts to deal with different things. And in fact, in internal family system theory, we say that we all come with a multiplicity of a mind. The mind can adjust and adapt to different situations, and we adjust how we behave, how we talk, what our emotions are for each of those situations. But when it becomes that because there's trauma, there may be a defense to that. There may be a manager or a part of us that keeps us from getting hurt or keeps the adaptive information processing model talks about how the trauma may get locked up in the brain so that a child cannot be kind of blindsided by emotions that they don't feel they can handle and memories that they can't handle. There may be parts that protect us or protect the child from feeling that locked up stuff. And they can be a critic. They can be like, don't act like that. Don't let them know what's happening. And many of us have an internal critic. We might have an internal manager. Boy, I better get up soon. I got to get this packed, got to get this done so that I can get to work or get to school. With children, they may have managers and what internal family systems call firefighters, which may do something like, for a teenager, I'm just going to drink so I don't feel the pain anymore. I'm going to cut myself because I don't know what else to do. And it takes my mind off the big emotions that I'm feeling that I can't handle. Okay. And the cognitive skills. This is the stuff that teachers and most people in the schools are already looking for. So what I'm asking you to do today is begin to think even more broadly and more deeply into the brain development and see if you can see some of the clues that other things have happened. And then again, this is more the neocortex as the child figures out their identity and their self-concept. All right. So Dr. Perry says that if we're going to do interventions and activities, what we need to do is we need to make sure with children with trauma that the things that we do are relational and safe. Safety is first. That's the bottom of the brain. If we're going to work on the brain, we have to have safety first. They need to be relevant, developmentally matched. So let's not be up in the top of the brain when a child has not got the development to sustain that. They need to be repetitive and patterned. They need to be pleasurable. That's why I suggest play is one of the ways to do that. They need to be rhythmic, resonant with the neural patterns and respectful of the child, the family, the culture. So let's talk about a few brain areas here. So this one, the item whose name I have just forgotten.
The expanding
ball. This is really good for the brainstem. just giving it to a child to begin to use themselves, it distracts them, it gets their attention into a different place. I've had kids who put their head inside and it's a whole world inside this thing. They can also, you can have them at the start of a therapy session, or if you only have 5 minutes with them, give it to them at Hoberman Sphere. Give it to them and let them breathe a little bit and see if they will re-regulate. And then you can talk with the child about what's going on and what were you feeling. So think in terms of body, brain, and heart. What's going, and heart being emotions. So a child who might be depressed or anxious. I love these giraffes. The kids often pick their own colors that they want to use if they come in. And now that we're doing virtual, I've managed to get some of these to some of my children. So I asked them, how was your week? How anxious are you today? And this is totally in a panic. This is somewhere in the middle and just a little bit. So they love to show me where they are each day. Depression. How depressed are you? Well, kind of halfway. Important to check in with kids on how depressed they are. So this is a great way to externalize what's going on inside. For children that are young and have attachment needs or older, be there for them. Really pay attention. Even if it's a 2-minute thing in the classroom or when you see the child, just really listen. Look at them. Keep your mind open and keep your own stress and imperatives for the day back here. Just ask them to step back a little so you can be with this child and really attune to them and say, how are you doing? Or what do you want right now? Or what are you feeling? And then just repeat back to them what they said. Don't interpret, don't make up your own words for it. Just be with them. And that can help with attunement. And the child begins to trust that each time they see you, they will get some attunement from you. Doesn't mean you have to give them 10 minutes, half an hour, an hour. I mean, you might be on the playground. Just the fact that a child is seen and listened to can be huge. If a child is scared, you can ask them to externalize by finding things that will protect them. So you might ask them to choose things that will protect them. What about a fire-breathing dragon? You wouldn't offer it. You'd say, here are some things. Is there anything here that might help you feel protected? And they can begin to establish for themselves a kind of imaginative safe place. Children that you suspect are dissociated. You can say, so how much are you in the room? Are you all the way in the room? Are you kind of halfway in the room? Or are you not here at all? And it's a great way to check in with kids. They will tell you, how much of me is present right now. You can ask them if they would like to, if they can tell you how big their emotions are right now or what they're feeling. So what is your anger? How big is your anger right now? Is it this big? Is it this big? I don't know if you can see these. How big is it? So using these stacking dolls can often really help. Is it little tiny? Is it even tinier? How much sadness do you feel? See if the child can learn their emotions and get, what is your body telling you? What is your mind telling you? What are your emotions telling you? And see if the child can talk to you from all those dimensions and actually become more fluent in their emotional literacy. More mirroring and things like that are, a lot of us have those charts of different feelings, and having a child choose the feelings and then having us guess what they're feeling. Be a little careful with things like anger for yourself. If a child says, I want you to show me an angry face, be careful, just be aware. You may have to change it quickly if the child gets triggered. But in general, children love to be able to play with emotions. And the more they play, the more they become more aware of how emotions feel in their body. Whether it's an emotional state that they get into or whether it is how to be regulated, how to feel regulated. And most of all, The way children learn how to regulate their emotions is having a regulated adult sitting next to them. So think of a toddler who's throwing themselves on the floor and some toy has just been taken away or is broken, and they're just having the huge reaction. The fact that you can sit with them and let them know that you're there begins to reassure them that they can also handle those big emotions. You're not reacting. If you bring your angry part to that and they're bringing their distressed part, and your angry part works on their distressed part, then they may go further into the brainstem instead of further into the cortex. But if you can be with them so that it's a relational healing, and then they are able to begin to match you relationally, and then you can talk through, yeah, you know, looked like you were really feeling sad and upset. And then they can begin to find ways to handle that and trust themselves in the future. So, again, start from the bottom of the brain and move up, regulate, relate, and then reason. You go too fast, you're going to end up having to go back down again and start again. There is a wonderful handout about what kind of therapies you can use for different symptoms and needs of a child that's had trauma. And a lot of resources. Some of these have picture cards, some of them have toolkits. I really encourage you to check them out. And if you're interested in attachment, there is, in my bibliography, there's this integrative parenting strategies for raising children affected by attachment trauma. And it goes with a book for therapists for integrative team treatment for attachment and trauma repair in children. So they're listed in the bibliography right after these resources. And I encourage you maybe to get together with other therapists and see if you can offer things like this. The website, the third one down, has training classes for $99 for huge, many sessions for parents so that they can learn how to repair attachment with their children and deal with that. Okay, so what do we bring? We bring ourselves. So the more we can be regulated ourselves, own our self-care, pay attention to our neuroception, that's what we need to be doing. And I'm going to encourage you to find this in your packet. I'm pretty sure I put it in. Can you see it, Arlyn? If not, you will find it on the Beacon. Yes, it is included. So you can find it on the Beacon website as well. And again, different places you can get resources. These are some of the resources I quoted from. And I want to thank you for coming today. Robin, is there anything in this last 2 minutes that you think people may be wondering?
So, I wrote a bunch of notes. I guess I'll narrow it down, Arlyn, to treatment modalities.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned that you're an internal family systems therapist. I think you mentioned that, or maybe I just know that.
Mm-hmm.
And an EMDR, certified EMDR therapist. And I think therapists and so forth might be wondering what treatment modalities, trainings you might recommend. And you've spoken to it, but I just thought maybe to underscore.
Well, if you haven't done EMDR training or whatever, I would encourage you to do at least DBT, because that is about regulation. It's about regulating the unregulated emotions up to the point where then the CBT will work with a child.
So dialectical behavior and cognitive behavioral therapies.
Yes.
Okay.
Trauma-informed cognitive behavioral therapy, I recommend.
Right.
Because if you're talking to them up here and their brain is working lower, you're not going to get very far. It's not going to work. Play therapy, I fully recommend. I really encourage child-centered play therapy. That allows the children, and also filial therapy, where the parent learns how to do it. That I have seen work over and over in the last 7 years.